Hello, my name is James. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. In 1722, a 62-year-old Dutch lawyer, on his very first command, sailed into the most remote corner of the Pacific Ocean and found something that has puzzled the world ever since. Nearly 900 enormous stone figures, standing silent on a tiny volcanic island, 3,500 kilometers from the nearest continent. The islanders themselves had no idea how they got there. Tonight, we'll follow his extraordinary voyage, from the storms of Cape Horn to the mystery of Easter Island, in a single, uninterrupted sleep story. So settle in. Get comfortable. The Pacific is waiting. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In and out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey towards sleep. And now, let us begin. Tonight, we are going back. Back past the hum of engines and the glow of screens. Back past railways and telegraphs. Back to a time when the surface of our own planet was still, in very large measure, a mystery. When sailors set out across open water, not entirely certain what lay on the other side. When entire oceans existed as rumor and speculation on a hand-drawn map. We are going back to the early 18th century, to a world of tall ships and trade winds, of candlelight and compasses, of ink-stained charts with blank spaces at their edges, where the mapmaker had simply run out of knowledge. It is the year 1721, and somewhere in the calm of a Dutch harbour, a 62-year-old man, not a sailor by training, not a soldier or an adventurer, but a lawyer, is preparing to do something extraordinary. His name is Jacob Roggeveen, and he is about to sail to the other side of the world. To understand why Jacob Roggeveen's voyage matters, we need to feel the world as it was in those first decades of the 1700s. Europe, and the Netherlands in particular, had grown extraordinarily rich on the back of ocean trade. Spices from the East Indies, silk from the Far East, sugar from the Caribbean, silver from the mines of South America. The world's wealth was moving across open water, in the bellies of wooden ships, and the great European powers were competing, sometimes peacefully, often violently, to control those trade routes. The Dutch, in particular, had built one of the most powerful commercial empires in history. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials, the VOC, controlled the sea routes to Asia, around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, through the islands of what we now call Indonesia. It was one of the wealthiest organizations in human history, with its own ships, its own soldiers, its own laws. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a nation within a nation. But the Pacific, that vast, blue world west of the Americas, told a different story. The high seas of the Pacific in the early 18th century were still dangerous, still lawless, still littered with pirates and buccaneers following in the wake of men like Francis Drake and William Dampier, names you may remember from earlier nights on this channel. Privateers who had rounded Cape Horn or crossed the Atlantic and found riches in the Spanish trade routes of the Pacific. The Spice Islands were known. The great galleon routes between Acapulco in Mexico and Manila in the Philippines had been sailing for over a century. But all of this known world, existed in the northern and western Pacific. In the south, in the vast, open, southern Pacific, almost nothing was certain. Let that sink in for a moment. An ocean larger than all of Earth's landmasses combined. And in its southern reaches, in the early 1700s, Europeans knew almost nothing at all. There was a theory, an ancient theory, actually, stretching back to the Greeks, that there must be a great southern continent. A massive landmass somewhere in the deep south of the globe, balancing the weight of the lands in the north. Philosophers had argued for it. Geographers had written about it. Sailors had dreamed of it. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. By the 1720s, pieces of coastline had been glimpsed. The Dutch navigator Abel Tasman had found what we now call New Zealand and the island of Tasmania in the 1640s. The western coast of Australia had been charted in rough outline, but these felt like fragments, isolated landings, rocky shores briefly touched and then left behind. Whether they were part of some great southern landmass, or merely islands scattered in an empty sea, nobody truly knew. Nobody had sailed far enough south to find out. The cold was too fierce, the storms too unpredictable, the ice too dangerous. The Antarctic continent itself lay undiscovered, unknown, unseen, untouched, and would remain so for another 100 years. And so, in the early 1700s, the southern Pacific was the last great blank space on the map of the world. It was filled, on paper, with dotted lines and hopeful speculation, with island names that may or may not have existed, with coastlines glimpsed once and never found again, and always, somewhere further south, the dream of that great unknown continent, waiting, perhaps, to be found. Now, there was one more invisible enemy that haunted every long voyage of this era, one that shaped every route, every schedule, every desperate decision about when to make landfall. It was not pirates, not storms, not rival navies. It was scurvy. Scurvy was the great killer of the age of sail. A disease we now know is caused by lack of vitamin C, lack of fresh fruit and vegetables on long ocean passages. But in the early 18th century, nobody understood why it happened or how to prevent it. After 6 to 8 weeks at sea without fresh food, a sailor's body would begin to break down. His gums would swell and bleed. His old wounds would reopen. His joints would ache with a terrible, grinding pain. He would grow exhausted, delirious, and eventually, if land was not found, he would die. On long Pacific voyages, scurvy could kill a third of a ship's crew, sometimes more. It was the hidden tax that every Pacific expedition paid. And there was one more challenge facing every navigator of the age, one that was, in its own way, just as dangerous as disease or storm. It was the problem of knowing where you were. Latitude, your position north or south, could be measured with reasonable accuracy using the angle of the sun above the horizon at noon. Any competent navigator could do it. But longitude, your position east or west, was a different matter entirely. Without a reliable way to compare local time with a fixed reference point, you simply could not know how far around the world you had sailed. Navigators used a method called dead reckoning, estimating their position based on speed and direction and time elapsed. Skilled observers could sometimes use the moons of Jupiter or solar and lunar eclipses as reference points. But these calculations were fiendishly difficult on the lurching, swaying deck of a sailing ship in open ocean. The result was that even the most skilled navigator of the early 18th century could be many hundreds of miles from where he thought he was. Islands appeared and then could never be found again, because the man who'd seen them had written down a position that was simply wrong. The longitude problem would not be properly solved until later in the century, a story for another night on this channel. But in 1721, as Jacob Roggeveen prepared his voyage, it remained one of the great unsolved puzzles of the age. And so this was the world into which our 62-year-old Dutch lawyer was about to sail. An ocean that was vast, poorly charted, and only partially understood. A disease with no known cure waiting for him in every week that passed without fresh food. Navigation that was, in the southern reaches of the Pacific, still close to guesswork. And yet he went. Breathe slowly. Settle deeper. Next we will meet Jacob Roggeveen properly, a man of surprising background, with a surprising reason for going, and we will listen as his 3 ships slip quietly out of harbor and turn their bows toward the west. The voyage is only beginning. We have spoken of a world of blank spaces, of oceans that existed, in the minds of mapmakers, as little more than hopeful lines and careful guesses. of a great southern continent that philosophers had imagined and sailors had dreamed of, but that no living person had ever seen. And now we meet the man who would sail into that world, not as a young adventurer burning with ambition, but as a 62-year-old Dutchman, silver-haired, careful, and patient. A man who had spent most of his life not on the open ocean, but behind a desk. Jacob Roggeveen was born in 1659 in the Dutch city of Middelburg, a prosperous, quietly beautiful town in the province of Zeeland, in the southwestern corner of the Netherlands. Middelburg was a trading city, close to the sea, shaped by the rhythms of commerce and navigation. It was a city where man might grow up hearing the names of distant oceans the way other children heard the names of neighboring streets. His father, Arend Roggeveen, had been a mathematician and a cartographer, a maker of maps. And Arend had spent much of his life fascinated by a particular question, the question of the great southern continent. He had even petitioned the Dutch West India Company to sponsor an expedition to find it. The petition was denied. Arend Roggeveen died with his dream unrealized. Jacob inherited that dream. But Jacob's path was not the sea, not at first. He trained as a lawyer, built a careful and respectable career, and eventually moved to Middelburg's Dutch colonial outpost of Batavia, the city we now call Jakarta on the island of Java, where he worked as a legal administrator for a number of years. He was a man of order, of documents, of measured argument. Not the obvious profile of a Pacific explorer. And yet the dream his father had planted never left him. Through middle age and into old age, Jacob Roggeveen carried it quietly, the southern continent. The blank space on the map. The voyage that had never been made. When he finally retired, returned to the Netherlands, and turned his attention fully to the project that had haunted his family for a generation, he was 60 years old. Most men of his era and his class considered their adventuring, if they had ever done any, long behind them. Roggeveen was only just beginning. Breathe gently. Feel the comfort of the bed beneath you. There is nothing to do, nothing to decide. Only this story, unfolding slowly in the dark. Now, to sail the Pacific in the early 18th century, a man needed more than a dream. He needed ships. He needed crew. He needed provisions. And above all, he needed money. Serious money. The kind that only a powerful institution could provide. The obvious sponsor, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was not an option. The VOC controlled the eastern trade routes around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, through the Indonesian archipelago. Their charter gave them an exclusive monopoly on Dutch trade in those waters. Any Dutch ship that entered the Pacific from the west, through the Indian Ocean, was, legally, under VOC authority. But there was another company, a rival, smaller, and considerably less powerful organization, the Dutch West India Company, the WIC. The West India Company held its own charter for trade in the Americas and along the west coast of Africa. And crucially, their charter included a different route into the Pacific, around the southern tip of South America, through the waters west of Cape Horn. Roggeveen approached the West India Company. He presented his plan. He spoke of the great southern continent, of new trade routes, of undiscovered lands. The company listened, and in 1721 they agreed to fund the expedition. 3 ships were prepared. The largest was the Arend, the Eagle, Roggeveen's flagship, a substantial vessel of around 50 guns. The second was the Theenhoven, The third was a smaller vessel called the Afrikaanse galley, the African galley. Let those names rest in your mind for a moment. The Eagle, the Theenhoven, the African galley, 3 wooden ships, provisioned and crewed, preparing to sail into the most remote ocean on Earth. The total crew across all 3 vessels numbered around 250 men. Sailors, officers, surgeons, carpenters, the various specialists that a long ocean voyage required. Most of them had never seen the Pacific. Many of them had never sailed beyond European waters. They were about to spend months, possibly more than a year, at sea, in some of the least known waters on the planet. And leading them was a 62-year-old lawyer on his very first command. Let your breathing grow even slower. Let the darkness behind your eyes grow soft and deep. You are perfectly safe, perfectly still. The world is at rest around you. In August of 1721, the 3 ships of Jacob Roggeveen's expedition departed from the Dutch harbour of Texel and sailed south. Their route was deliberate and carefully chosen. Rather than sailing east toward the Cape of Good Hope, which would have taken them into VOC-controlled waters, they turned southwest toward the Atlantic. They crossed that ocean, rounded the coast of South America, and set their course for the most feared passage in the sailing world. Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of South America, a rocky, storm-lashed headland at the very bottom of the world, had been the graveyard of ships since the first Europeans had attempted to round it in the early 1600s. The seas there were unlike anything in temperate waters. The Southern Ocean funnels through the narrow gap between the tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, compressed and accelerated, whipped by winds that have circled the globe with nothing to slow them down. Waves 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet high. Storms that arrived without warning. Cold that was not merely uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. To attempt Cape Horn from the east, sailing westward, fighting both the current and the prevailing wind, was considered among the most difficult feats in navigation. It could take weeks. It could take a month. It could, and for some ships, it did, prove impossible. Roggeveen chose this route for a very specific reason. By approaching from the east, he stayed out of the Indian Ocean and beyond the legal reach of the Dutch East India Company. The route around Cape Horn was, in a sense, the West India Company's door into the Pacific. And through that door, Roggeveen intended to sail as far south as any ship had ever gone, searching, as his father had dreamed, for the great unknown continent. Feel the ship beneath you, the deep, slow roll of open ocean, the cold air, the vast dark sky above, scattered with more stars than you can count, stars that navigators read like a language, finding their position in the turning of the heavens. The 3 ships rounded Cape Horn in January of 1722, in the southern hemisphere's summer, the best possible season for such an attempt, and still brutal enough. They battled the swells, they fought the winds, and eventually, slowly, triumphantly, they emerged into the Pacific. The great ocean opened before them. Immense, blue, impossibly wide. And somewhere out there, in all that blue immensity, Jacob Roggeveen believed, as his father had believed before him, that a continent waited to be found. He turned his ships southwest, into the unknown, and the Pacific swallowed them whole. Sleep is close now. Let it come. Let your thoughts grow light and loose, like clouds drifting apart in a morning sky. Next, on an extraordinary Sunday morning in April of 1722, A lookout on the Arend will spot something on the horizon. Something that no European crew had ever seen before. A small, lonely island, impossibly far from anywhere. And standing on its shores, against the pale sky, the silent silhouettes of enormous stone figures. Rest now. The island is waiting. You are still here, still resting, still drifting on that slow, quiet tide. The Pacific surrounds the three ships now, the Eagle, the Theenhoven, the African Galley, as they push southwest into waters that no Dutch crew has ever crossed. The ocean is vast beyond imagining. Day after day, the horizon is the same in every direction. A perfect circle of blue water meeting blue sky, with the three small ships at its center, moving so slowly that the horizon seems never to change at all. The crew settles into the rhythm of the long passage. Watch rotations. The daily ration of salt meat and hardtack biscuit. The careful inspection of the water barrels. The surgeon moving quietly through the lower decks, watching for the first signs of swollen gums and aching joints that would tell him scurvy had arrived. Roggeveen, in his cabin, bends over his charts. He measures. He calculates. He pushes his ships further south than any Dutch expedition before him, looking for the coastline that he believes must be there. The great southern continent, his father's dream, carried all this way across the world. But the ocean gives him nothing. Only water. Only silence. Only the long, unhurried breathing of the southern Pacific. And then, on the first day of April, 1722, something changes. A lookout, high in the rigging of the Eagle, shouts down to the deck below. There is something on the horizon. Not the flat, featureless line they have grown so accustomed to seeing. Something different. Something low and dark and solid, rising just barely above the surface of the sea. Land. Let that word settle for a moment. Land. After weeks of open ocean, in some of the most remote waters on the planet, the most welcome word in any sailor's vocabulary. Roggeveen ordered the ships to slow, to wait. It was a prudent decision. Approaching an unknown coastline in darkness was how ships were lost on reefs, and so through the long hours of that night the three vessels drifted, their crews straining to see the shape of the land in the darkness. When dawn came on the 2nd of April, 1722, the island revealed itself fully. It was small, perhaps 24 kilometers from end to end, shaped roughly like a triangle, rising to volcanic peaks that caught the early morning light. The interior was brown and treeless, a landscape that looked, to European eyes, almost barren. No great forests, no rivers visible from the sea. A rocky, wind-scoured place at the very edge of the known world. But it was inhabited. That much was immediately clear. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy and still. The island is coming into view, very slowly, through the early morning light. The date of the discovery was in the week of Easter in April, 1722, on Easter Sunday. And so Jacob Roggeveen opened his log and wrote down a name for this place he had found. This tiny, improbable triangle of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. He called it Pash Island, Easter Island. It is the name by which the world has known it ever since. The island sits at a staggering distance from anywhere else. The nearest inhabited land, the Pitcairn Islands, themselves one of the most remote places on Earth, lies over 2,000 kilometers to the west. The coast of South America is over 3,500 kilometers to the east. Easter Island is, by most measures, the most isolated inhabited island on the surface of the planet. That human beings had not only found it, but made it their home, is itself a kind of miracle. The people who greeted Roggeveen's ships from the shore, waving, calling out, some of them paddling small canoes out toward the anchored vessels, were Polynesian. Their ancestors had made one of the most extraordinary ocean voyages in human history, navigating by stars and wave patterns and the flight paths of birds across thousands of miles of open Pacific, and landing on this tiny speck of land without instruments, without maps, without anything but knowledge and courage and extraordinary seamanship. Roggeveen, watching them from the deck of the Eagle, had no way of knowing any of this. To him, they were simply the islanders, curious, apparently friendly, and wearing very little clothing against the warm Pacific air. But it was not the people that stopped Roggeveen's crew in their tracks. It was what stood behind them. Along the coast of the island, ranged against the sky, were figures. Enormous figures. Stone figures, standing upright on raised stone platforms, their backs to the sea, their long faces turned toward the interior of the island. Some stood alone. Some stood in rows. They were tall, some of them reaching 8, 9, 10 meters or more in height, and they had a quality that is very hard to describe, but that every person who has ever seen them in any century seems to feel immediately. They were watching, not with menace, not with threat, but with a calm, settled, ancient attention, as though they had been standing there for so long, in such patient silence, that the passage of ships and centuries in human lifetimes was simply something they observed, without surprise, from a great and tranquil distance. Roggeveen's men stared. Hard-bitten Dutch sailors, men who had rounded Cape Horn and crossed the South Atlantic, men who prided themselves on taking the world as they found it, they stared and they could not look away. Nobody had seen anything like this. Let your breathing slow to almost nothing. Let the image settle in your mind, those great stone faces, looking inward, calm and still above the blue water. These figures are known today as moai. There are almost 900 of them on the island, in various states of completion and preservation. They were carved from the compressed volcanic ash of a single quarry, a crater called Reno Roriku, using only stone tools. No metal, no wheels, no cranes, no draft animals of any kind. Just human hands, stone chisels, and an extraordinary, sustained collective effort that lasted for centuries. The moai are not, as is sometimes thought, simply heads. Most have full bodies, torsos, arms held tight against their sides, hands resting at the hips. Many have been buried up to their necks by centuries of soil accumulation, which is why the heads seem to stand alone. The largest moai ever erected stands nearly 10 meters tall and weighs over 80 tons. The largest ever carved, never finished, never raised, lies still in the quarry where it was begun, nearly 22 meters long. How the islanders moved them, these multi-ton figures across kilometers of uneven volcanic landscape, is a question that has fascinated and puzzled researchers for 3 centuries. The most widely supported modern theory is that they were walked upright, rocked from side to side by teams of people pulling on ropes, in a slow, swaying, upright procession across the island. The islanders themselves, when asked by later researchers, said simply, they walked. Roggeveen, standing on the deck of the Eagle in April of 1722, was one of the first European eyes ever to rest on the moai. He wrote about them at length in his journal, with wonder, and with the careful, loyally attention to detail that characterized everything he recorded. But his explanation of what he was seeing was, as we shall discover, beautifully, entirely wrong. He looked at the great stone figures, at their smooth faces and the moss and lichen that covered them in places, and he reached a conclusion that seemed reasonable to him given everything he knew. He concluded that they were not carved from solid stone at all. He believed they were constructed in place, built up from a kind of clay or mud or plaster, modeled by hand into their great shapes, and then baked hard in the sun. He was, of course, completely mistaken. The moai are solid volcanic stone, carved with extraordinary skill and patience from the living rock of the island itself. But Roggeveen had no way of knowing that from the deck of a ship at anchor. He saw what he could see. He drew a conclusion. He wrote it down. And in doing so, he joined a very long tradition of intelligent people looking at Easter Island and arriving at an answer that felt certain, and turned out, in time, to be something else entirely. Sleep is gathering now. You can feel it at the edges of your thoughts, soft and patient, like the tide coming in. The ships are at anchor off the coast of Easter Island. Tomorrow, Roggeveen will go ashore. He will walk among the moai. He will meet the islanders. And something will happen on that shore, something unexpected, something that will shadow the rest of his journey, that no amount of careful planning could have prepared him for. Let the image carry you. The great stone faces against the Pacific sky. The slow roll of the ship at anchor. The stars coming out, one by one, above the most isolated island on Earth. Rest now. You are perfectly safe. Perfectly still. The ships are at anchor in the quiet dark off the coast of Easter Island. The great stone figures stand along the shore, their backs to the sea, their long faces turned inward. The island is silent. The crew of the Eagle, the Theenhoven, and the African galley sleep in their hammocks below decks, worn out from weeks of open ocean, lulled by the slow rock of the ship in the swell. And Jacob Roggeveen, perhaps, lies awake, thinking, planning, writing in his journal by candlelight, in his careful, precise hand, trying to make sense of what he has found. Tomorrow, he will go ashore. The morning broke clear and warm over Easter Island. Roggeveen prepared a landing party, a group of around 150 men, drawn from all three ships, armed but under strict orders to behave peacefully. Roggeveen was a careful man, a lawyer by instinct, and he understood that first contact with an unknown people required patience and goodwill. He had no interest in violence. He wanted to observe, to trade, to record, and to understand, if he could, the extraordinary stone figures that lined the island's coast. The islanders, for their part, were not hiding. They had been watching the three ships since they appeared on the horizon. Some had paddled out in small canoes, climbing aboard the Dutch vessels with a cheerful boldness that surprised the crew, helping themselves, with apparent innocence, to whatever objects caught their attention. A hat, a length of rope, a small tool left unattended on the deck, not with any sense of malice, but with the easy curiosity of people who had never encountered the concept of European property ownership. This detail would matter before the morning was out. Breathe gently. Let your body settle deeper into the warmth around you. The island morning is warm and bright, the air carrying the faint salt smell of the Pacific. The landing party rowed ashore in small boats, crunching up onto the black volcanic sand of the beach. And there, for the first time, Roggeveen and his men stood on Easter Island and looked at the Moai not from a distance, not from the deck of a ship, but up close. The experience, recorded in the journals of several crew members, was one of overwhelming strangeness. These were not small carvings. They were not decorative objects. They were enormous, towering above the men who stood before them, and they had been placed on long stone platforms called ahu, raised above the level of the surrounding ground, so that they seemed to loom even larger than their already considerable height suggested. Roggeveen noted that the islanders appeared to hold the figures in reverence. In the early morning, before the Dutch had come ashore, some of the islanders had been seen lighting fires before the platforms and sitting in postures that suggested prayer or meditation. They bowed their heads. They held their hands toward the figures. Whatever the Moai meant to the people of Easter Island, they were clearly not simply monuments or decorations. They were, in some deep sense, sacred. And yet, when Roggeveen and his men asked, through gestures and the careful, patient work of attempted communication, the islanders could not explain how the Moai had been made. This is one of the most haunting details of the entire encounter. The people living on Easter Island in 1722 did not know. They had no clear account, no story that Roggeveen could extract, no tradition he could identify, that explained the construction of the figures. It was as though the Moai had always been there, as though they predated living memory so completely that the knowledge of their making had simply dissolved, passed out of the world with the generations that had held it. We now know, from modern archaeology, that the construction of the Moai spans several centuries, from roughly the 13th to the 17th century. By the time Roggeveen arrived, the most recent Moai had been standing for perhaps 100 years, the oldest for 4 or 5 centuries. The civilization that had built them, the complex, organized, enormously energetic society that had quarried and carved and transported and raised these 900 figures across a small volcanic island, had, by 1722, already begun its long decline. The reasons for that decline are complicated and debated and quietly devastating. But the result, by the time of Roggeveen's visit, was a people living in the ruins of something extraordinary they could no longer fully explain. Let that thought rest quietly in your mind. The islanders, living among the greatest achievement of their ancestors, no longer knowing how it had been done. Your breathing is slow. Your body is heavy and warm. The story continues, gently, around you. Trading began on the beach that morning, and it went well at first. The islanders brought bananas, sweet potatoes, sugarcane, and quantities of fresh water, all of which the Dutch received with enormous gratitude after weeks at sea. Roggeveen's men offered cloth, nails, and small European goods in return. The exchange was friendly. The atmosphere, by multiple accounts, was one of genuine goodwill on both sides. The people of Easter Island were, by the accounts of Roggeveen's crew, striking in their appearance. Tall, well-built, tattooed across their bodies in elaborate patterns. Their earlobes were stretched and elongated, extended by heavy ornaments worn from childhood, and some of the men wore headdresses of feathers. The crew noted that the islanders showed no fear of the Dutch ships or of the men who had come ashore from them. They were curious, confident, and welcoming. The island's population at the time of the visit has been estimated at somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, a fraction, archaeologists now believe, of the population that had existed at the height of the Moai building era, perhaps several centuries earlier. But then something went wrong. The precise sequence of events is disputed, The Dutch accounts differ in their details, and there is, of course, no written record from the islanders' perspective. What seems clear is this: at some point during the landing, some of the islanders began taking objects from the Dutch sailors. Muskets, equipment, items that the islanders, with no experience of firearms, may simply have regarded as interesting objects, the same easy, curious pilfering that had happened on the ships the day before. The Dutch sailors, alarmed, reacted. Shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, somewhere between 10 and 12 islanders lay dead or dying on the black sand of the beach. Others were wounded. The Dutch, shaken, reformed their lines. The islanders scattered into the interior of the island. It was over in moments, and it cast a long, cold shadow over everything that followed. Breathe slowly, softly. This is the weight that history sometimes carries, the sudden, irreversible moment. Let it settle gently and pass. Roggeveen, to his credit, appears to have been genuinely troubled by what had happened. His journal entries from the days that followed suggest a man trying to understand an event that had spiraled beyond his intentions or his orders. He had not come to Easter Island for violence. He had come, in the spirit of his father's dream, to discover and to understand. The Dutch remained on Easter Island for only a few days in total. They continued to trade with the islanders, who, with a generosity and resilience that Roggeveen noted with evident respect, returned to the beach and resumed contact despite the violence of that first morning. Fresh food was obtained. Water was taken aboard. The great stone figures were observed and recorded, and Roggeveen, walking among the moai, reached his conclusion about their construction, that they were molded from clay and plaster, not carved from stone. He pressed his hand against the surface of one, feeling what he believed was a mixture of gravel and mud. He was touching, in fact, the lichen and weathering of centuries on solid volcanic rock. But he wrote down what he believed he felt, and moved on. By the time the three ships weighed anchor and turned their bows away from Easter Island, heading northwest into the open Pacific, the crew carried with them something that would prove difficult to set aside. They had seen the moai. They had stood in their shadow. They had watched the islanders move among them with reverence. And they had left behind, on that black volcanic sand, the consequences of a terrible, irreversible morning. The island shrank behind them. The stone figures diminished with the distance, until they were too small to see, and then the island itself slipped below the horizon, and there was only the Pacific again, vast, blue, indifferent, and the three ships moving through it, carrying their wonder and their guilt in equal measure. Sleep is very close now. Let it come. Next, the voyage continues northwest, and almost immediately, the Pacific delivers its next surprise. A reef, invisible beneath the surface of the blue water. A terrible sound of timber and rushing sea. And the loss of one of Roggeveen's three ships. Rest now. The ocean is wide and the night is deep. You are safe. You are warm. Let the story carry you down. You are drifting now. Beautifully, peacefully drifting. The three ships have left Easter Island behind. The stone figures have slipped below the horizon. The black volcanic sand, the Ahu platforms, the memory of smoke on a bright morning, all of it receding now into the vast blue indifference of the Pacific. Roggeveen stands at the stern of the Eagle, perhaps watching the place where the island was, making notes, thinking. The lawyer in him ordering the facts, filing them away. The dreamer in him, his father's son, already turning to face what lies ahead. The Pacific opens before the three ships. Northwest. Into the unknown. The ocean they were now sailing through, the Central and Western Pacific, was, even by the standards of the early 18th century, among the least understood bodies of water on Earth. The Spanish had been crossing it for a century and a half, on their great galleon route between Acapulco and Manila. But that route ran far to the north, in reliable trade winds, following a path that had been established and refined over generations. It touched almost none of the vast central and southern Pacific. The thousands of islands scattered across this ocean, the archipelagos and atolls and raised coral reefs that make the Pacific the most island-rich ocean on Earth, were, for the most part, unknown to European cartographers. Some had been glimpsed. A few had been named. But the Central Pacific in 1722 was still, on the best available charts, largely empty space. Dotted lines. Uncertain coordinates. The ghosts of islands seen once and never found again. And beneath the surface of that beautiful blue water, invisible until the last possible moment, lay the reefs. Breathe slowly. Feel the warmth around you. The story is carrying you gently, gently forward. The Tuamotu archipelago is one of the largest chains of atolls in the world, a vast, low-lying scatter of coral islands and reefs stretching across a huge swathe of the central South Pacific. From above, or on a modern map, the Tuamotus are extraordinary. A constellation of turquoise lagoons and white sand and living coral, some of the most beautiful places on the surface of the planet. From the deck of a sailing ship in 1722, they were a death trap. The atolls of the Tuamotu chain rise barely above sea level. From a distance, they are invisible until you are almost upon them. The reefs that surround them extend outward beneath the surface, shallow, jagged, unforgiving, and the currents between the islands are strong and unpredictable. Sailors who did not know the archipelago were sailing, in effect, through a vast minefield of underwater rock, with no warning and no chart worth trusting. Roggeveen's ships entered the Tuamotus in the weeks following their departure from Easter Island, feeling their way northwest with the care and anxiety of men who knew they were in dangerous waters but could not see the danger. And then the African galley struck a reef. The sound of a ship hitting a reef at speed is, by all accounts of those who have survived it, one of the most terrible sounds a sailor can hear. The grinding, splintering roar of timber against coral. The sudden lurch. The rush of cold water. The realization, arriving all at once, that the vessel beneath your feet, your home, your protection, your only means of surviving in the middle of an ocean, has been mortally wounded. The African galley, the smallest of Roggeveen's three ships, the vessel that had rounded Cape Horn and crossed the South Atlantic and stood at anchor off the shore of Easter Island, struck a reef in the Tuamotu archipelago and could not be saved. The crew was rescued. In the chaos of a shipwreck on a Pacific reef, with the surf breaking over the stricken vessel and the coral tearing at her hull, the men of the African galley were transferred to the Eagle and the Thienhoven. There were casualties. The historical record is not precise about numbers, but the crew was largely saved. The ship was not. The African galley broke apart on the reef and sank, taking with her the stores and equipment she had carried across 2 oceans. The expedition that had departed Texel with 3 vessels was now down to 2. Let that image rest quietly. The broken ship on the reef. The rescued crew, wet and shaken, crowded onto the remaining vessels. Roggeveen, counting heads, giving orders, his face revealing nothing of what he felt. Your breathing is slow. The night is deep around you. The two remaining ships pressed on, northwest through the Tuamotus, emerging eventually into the open ocean beyond. And now something began to happen that is, in its own quiet way, one of the most poignant aspects of the entire voyage. Islands began to appear. Not the dramatic, towering volcanic islands of Easter Island or the later Pacific explorers' accounts, but islands nonetheless, low shapes on the horizon, green against the blue, with the white line of surf visible on their reefs and, sometimes, the smoke of fires rising from their interiors. Signs of habitation. Signs of people. The ships were passing through the outer edges of what we now call the Society Islands, the archipelago that includes Tahiti, Moorea, Bora Bora, and their neighbors. These islands were, in 1722, completely unknown to Europeans. No Dutch, no Spanish, no English ship had ever anchored in their lagoons. The people who lived on them had never seen a European vessel. These were precisely the kind of discoveries that a Pacific expedition was supposed to make. New islands, new peoples, new trading possibilities. The kind of finds that would have been celebrated back in Amsterdam, written up in the journals of the learned societies, named and charted and added to the slowly growing map of the world. Roggeveen did not stop. This is the detail that haunts the story of the voyage, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Roggeveen had the islands in sight. He could see them. His crew could see them. And he sailed past. The reasons were practical and understandable and entirely human. The loss of the African galley had shaken the expedition deeply. The ships were now carrying the survivors of the wreck in addition to their original crews. Overcrowded, short on supplies, the careful calculations of provisioning disrupted by the sudden addition of extra mouths. The memory of Easter Island, of the morning on the beach, the shots, the bodies on the black sand, had left Roggeveen wary of further landings on unknown shores. And so the islands slipped past. Some were noted in the log. Some were given tentative names that would later be replaced when European explorers arrived in earnest, decades afterward. But none were investigated. None were properly charted. The canoes that sometimes paddled out from shore toward the passing ships were watched from a distance, and the ships moved on. Breathe gently. Let your body be heavy and still. There is something quietly beautiful about this. The islands passing in the night, unknown, unhurried, waiting for their moment in history. The same pattern continued as the ships moved further west and northwest, into the waters of what we now call the Samoan archipelago. Samoa in 1722 was, like the Society Islands, completely unknown to European cartographers. The great volcanic islands, their interiors green and mountainous, their lagoons vivid blue-green in the tropical light, rose from the Pacific ahead of Roggeveen's ships and passed astern and disappeared below the horizon. Roggeveen noted them. He wrote descriptions of the islands he could see, the fires visible on shore at night, the occasional canoe. He gave them a name. He called them the Bowman Islands, after one of his officers. The name did not survive. They are the Samoas now, as they have always been to the people who live on them. But again, he did not stop. Could not stop. The expedition was carrying too many men on too few ships, too far from any port where help could be found. The destination, Batavia, the Dutch colonial capital on the island of Java, was still thousands of miles to the west. Every day at sea without a proper resupply was a day closer to the point where scurvy would begin to take the crew. And so the islands of the Central Pacific, some of the most beautiful places on Earth, home to peoples with histories and cultures of extraordinary richness and depth, passed by, one after another, noted and named and left behind. There is something deeply human about Roggeveen's position in these weeks. He had set out to discover a continent. He had found, instead, an island with stone giants that his crew could not explain and an encounter that had ended in blood. He had lost one of his 3 ships on a reef. And now he was sailing through a sea of undiscovered islands that he lacked the resources, the crew space, and the heart to investigate. He was not a failure. He was a man doing his careful best in impossible circumstances, carrying his father's dream and the weight of Easter Island and the grief of the African galley all the way across the Pacific. But history is sometimes measured not only by what was found, but by what was past. Sleep is close, very close. Let it settle over you like a warm, heavy blanket, soft and dark and complete. Next, the 2 remaining ships finally reach Batavia. And there, after everything, after Cape Horn and Easter Island and the Tuamotu reefs and the islands that slipped away, Jacob Roggeveen finds not a welcome, but a confrontation. The Dutch East India Company is waiting for him. Rest now. The voyage is almost done. The ocean is dark and still and wide, and you are perfectly, completely safe. You are still here, still drifting. The 2 remaining ships, the Eagle and the Theenhoven, are moving west across the Pacific, leaving behind the islands they could not stop to explore. The crew is tired. The ships are crowded with the survivors of the African galley. The water barrels are being watched carefully, rationed with the quiet anxiety of men who know exactly how far they are from the nearest port. But the winds are steady, and the course is set, and Jacob Roggeveen, 63 years old now, worn by months at sea, carrying everything the voyage has given him and everything it has taken, stands at the bow of the Eagle and looks west. Toward Batavia. Toward home. Batavia in 1722 was one of the most important cities in the world, though the world outside the Dutch commercial empire barely knew it existed. It sat on the northwestern coast of the island of Java, in the archipelago we now call Indonesia. It had been founded by the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, in 1619, built on the site of an older Javanese port, and in the century since its founding it had grown into the administrative and commercial heart of the entire Dutch colonial enterprise in Asia. The city was, by all accounts, an extraordinary place. Its canals and merchant houses had been built in deliberate imitation of Amsterdam, the same orderly Dutch architecture, the same grid of waterways, the same careful urban geometry, transplanted to the tropics and surrounded by the sounds and smells and colors of Java. It was a city of enormous wealth and considerable danger. The tropical climate was brutal to Europeans, and the mortality rate among the Dutch residents of Batavia from malaria, dysentery, and other diseases was staggeringly high. Men who arrived healthy were often dead within a year. But it was the seat of VOC power in Asia, and it was to Batavia that all Dutch ships in the eastern seas eventually came. Breathe slowly. Let your body be completely still. The warm tropical air of Batavia is on the horizon, and with it, something Roggeveen has not anticipated. The Eagle and the Theenhoven sailed into Batavia harbor in the late northern summer of 1722, after a voyage of almost exactly 1 year. The crew was exhausted, thin, and deeply relieved to see the familiar outline of the city's warehouses and church spires rising above the harbor. They had done something remarkable. They had rounded Cape Horn. They had crossed the southern Pacific. They had discovered Easter Island and stood among its stone giants. They had survived the loss of a ship on the reefs of the Tuamotu archipelago. They had sailed through some of the most remote and uncharted waters in the world, and they had brought the 2 remaining ships safely to port. But the VOC was waiting. Almost before the anchor chains had finished running out, VOC officials came aboard. They were not there to congratulate Roggeveen. They were not there to hear about Easter Island, or the Moe, or the vast uncharted stretches of the South Pacific that the expedition had crossed. They were there to arrest him. The charge was straightforward from the VOC's perspective. Roggeveen had entered Pacific waters, VOC-controlled waters, as far as the company was concerned, without authorization. It did not matter to the VOC's lawyers that Roggeveen had been sponsored by the West India Company. It did not matter that he had entered the Pacific via Cape Horn, through the West India Company's legitimate domain. The VOC's charter, as they interpreted it, gave them authority over all Dutch commercial activity in the Pacific and the Eastern Seas. Roggeveen had sailed in their waters. He had traded, however briefly, however minimally, at Easter Island. He had, in the company's view, violated their monopoly. Both ships were seized. The Eagle and the Theenhoven, the vessels that had crossed 2 oceans, rounded Cape Horn, and made one of the most extraordinary voyages of the early 18th century, were impounded in Batavia harbor, their cargoes inventoried and confiscated by VOC officials. The crew, 200 men who had sailed for a year, who had survived a shipwreck and scurvy and the terrible morning on Easter Island, were stranded in Batavia, far from home, without pay and without a ship to carry them back to the Netherlands. Let that settle quietly. The weight of institutional power, descending on a small expedition at the end of a long voyage. The indignity of it. The exhausted disbelief. Your breathing is slow and even. The story holds you gently. Roggeveen himself was detained in Batavia for some months. He was not imprisoned in any dramatic sense. He was not put in chains or thrown into a cell. But he was held, questioned, his papers examined, his journals scrutinized. The VOC's apparatus of commercial law, the same machinery that had made the company the most powerful trading organization in the world, was turned on a 63-year-old lawyer who had sailed to Easter Island. There is something almost darkly comic about it, and Roggeveen, one suspects, was aware of the irony. He was a lawyer by training, a man who had spent his career navigating legal systems and commercial regulations. And now he found himself on the wrong side of the most powerful commercial legal apparatus in the world. He was eventually permitted to leave Batavia and make his way back to the Netherlands, not on his own ships, which remained impounded, but as a passenger on a VOC vessel. The journey home took months. He arrived in the Netherlands in 1722, older, wearier, and considerably poorer than when he had left. But Jacob Roggeveen was not a man who accepted injustice quietly. He was, after all, a lawyer. He brought the case to court. With the support of the Dutch West India Company, who had, after all, sponsored the voyage and had their own institutional interest in contesting the VOC's interpretation of the charter boundaries, Roggeveen mounted a legal challenge to the seizure of his ships and the confiscation of the expedition's assets. The case wound its way through the Dutch legal system with the slow, grinding patience that such cases require. Arguments were made. Documents were presented. The competing charter rights of the two great Dutch trading companies, the VOC and the WIC, were examined, debated, and weighed. And in 1724, 2 years after the ships had been seized in Batavia harbour, the court ruled in Roggeveen's favour. The seizure had been unlawful. The VOC had overstepped. The West India Company's charter did, in fact, authorise voyages around Cape Horn and into the Pacific, and the VOC had no legal right to impound ships that had entered the ocean by that route. The VOC was ordered to pay compensation. The costs of the expedition, or a substantial portion of them, were to be returned. Breathe gently. There is something deeply satisfying about this. The lawyer vindicated. The careful man, patient through injustice, waiting for the system he understood to work as it should. Let that satisfaction settle around you, warm and quiet. Roggeveen did not live to spend much of the compensation, or to enjoy a long retirement. He died in 1729, 7 years after his return from the Pacific, at the age of 70. By the standards of his era, it was a reasonable age. By the standards of a man who had rounded Cape Horn at 62 and survived a year in the Pacific, it was perhaps a little brief. He left behind his journals, his careful, precise, lawyerly record of everything he had seen and done and thought across that extraordinary year. The journals were published. The account of the voyage was read in the Netherlands and beyond, adding another fragment to the slowly growing European picture of the Pacific. And he left behind the name, Easter Island, Pash Island, written in his careful hand in the ship's log on the morning of Easter Sunday, April 1722. A name that has outlasted the VOC, outlasted the Dutch West India Company, outlasted the colonial empires and the trading monopolies and the chartered companies that shaped his world. The island is still there. The Moai are still there. And the name that a Dutch lawyer gave them, on a Sunday morning 3,500 kilometres from the nearest continent, is still the name by which the world knows them. Sleep is very nearly upon you now. Feel it in the weight of these words, in the slow space between them. Next, we will step back from the voyage itself and look at what it meant, what Roggeveen's extraordinary journey gave to the world, and what the world eventually gave back to the memory of the careful, determined, father-honoring Dutchman who made it. Rest now. You have traveled a long way tonight. The harbor is quiet. The ships are still. And somewhere, on the most isolated island in the world, the stone figures stand in the dark, as they have always stood, as they will always stand, their long faces turned toward the interior, watching. You are very nearly asleep now. The voyage is done. The ships are in harbor. The legal battle is won. Jacob Roggeveen, lawyer, dreamer, his father's son, has come home to the Netherlands, set down his journals, and stepped quietly back into the life of a private citizen. But the world he has touched is not finished with him. And the island he named on a Sunday morning in April of 1722 is only just beginning its long, extraordinary journey through history. Let us travel there one final time, slowly, gently, as the last stage of a long night's voyage. When Roggeveen's account of the expedition was published in the Netherlands, it caused a quiet sensation in the learned circles of European geography and natural philosophy. Here was confirmation, careful, documented, lawyerly confirmation, of something that the Pacific had been whispering to Europeans for decades. The ocean was full of islands. Islands with people on them. People with histories and cultures and achievements that defied easy explanation. The Moai of Easter Island, those enormous, patient stone figures standing on their platforms above the Pacific, became almost immediately one of the great puzzles of the age. How had they been made? How had they been moved? Who were the people who built them? And where had those people come from? These questions, first asked seriously by Roggeveen and his crew in April of 1722, have never entirely stopped being asked. They are still being asked today, and the answers, partial, provisional, endlessly revised, have opened windows onto one of the most remarkable human stories on the surface of our planet. Breathe slowly. Let the questions drift past like clouds. You don't need to answer them tonight. The next European to visit Easter Island after Roggeveen was the Spanish navigator Felipe González de Rejido, who arrived in 1770, nearly 50 years after Roggeveen's visit. González formally claimed the island for the Spanish crown, renamed it San Carlos, and had the island's chiefs sign a document of annexation. Whether the chiefs understood what they were signing is, to put it gently, doubtful. 4 years later, in 1774, the great English navigator James Cook arrived. Cook, one of the finest observers in the history of Pacific exploration, spent 4 days on the island, noted the Moai with his characteristic precision, and recorded something that added a new layer of mystery to an already mysterious place. Some of the Moai, he observed, had been toppled. Not all of them. Not most of them. But some, including figures that, from Roggeveen's account, had been standing upright in 1722, were now lying on their faces or their backs, thrown down from their ahu platforms. It was the beginning of a process that would, over the following decades, see virtually every standing Moai on Easter Island toppled by the islanders themselves. This is one of the most haunting chapters in the island story, and it speaks to something much deeper than mere vandalism. The toppling of the Moai, which archaeologists call the Huri Moai, the throwing down of statues, was not random or chaotic. It was deliberate and systematic, carried out over several generations, as rival clans and factions on the island engaged in cycles of conflict and retribution. To topple an enemy clan's Moai was to attack their ancestors, their spiritual power, their identity. It was an act of war conducted in stone. By the early 19th century, not a single Moai on Easter Island remained standing in its original position. Every one of the hundreds of figures that Roggeveen had seen watching calmly from their platforms had been thrown down. The ahu were broken. The stone faces lay in the grass, staring at the sky. The island that Roggeveen had found, already diminished from its greatest days, already carrying the weight of its own long decline, had fallen further still. Let that image settle quietly. The fallen figures, the broken platforms, the grass growing over stone faces turned toward the clouds. Your body is heavy and warm. Your breathing is slow and deep. The story holds you gently. The reasons for the decline of Easter Island civilization have been the subject of intense research and considerable debate. The most influential theory, developed in the late 20th century, proposed that the islanders had destroyed their own environment, that the great project of building and transporting the Moai had required timber on a massive scale, and that the islanders had cut down every tree on the island, leaving the soil vulnerable to erosion, destroying the ecosystem that sustained them, and ultimately collapsing their own society from within. This theory, compelling, cautionary, almost unbearably poignant in its implications, made Easter Island famous far beyond the world of archaeology. It became a parable, a warning, a small island that had consumed its own resources and paid the ultimate price. The story was told in books and documentaries and classrooms around the world. More recent research has complicated the picture considerably. Some archaeologists now argue that the deforestation was caused not by the Moai project alone, but significantly by rats. Polynesian rats that arrived with the first settlers multiplied rapidly and consumed the seeds of the island's palm trees before they could regenerate, preventing the forest from recovering from human clearance. Others argue that European contact and the catastrophic diseases, slave raids, and social disruption that followed played a far larger role in the island's demographic collapse than the internal dynamics of Moai building ever did. The truth, as is so often the case with Easter Island, is probably somewhere in the middle, a combination of factors, human and ecological and historical, layering themselves over centuries into a tragedy of extraordinary complexity. Breathe gently. These are not questions you need to carry tonight. Let them settle, like sediment in still water, slowly to the bottom. The modern story of Easter Island is, in many ways, a story of recovery and reclamation. The island, known in the language of its own people as Rapa Nui, a name that in various interpretations carries the meaning of Great Rapa or simply the navel of the world, became a Chilean territory in 1888, when the Chilean Navy took formal possession. For much of the following century, the island was managed as a sheep ranch, its people confined to a single settlement, their movement restricted by the Chilean authorities. But in the latter decades of the 20th century, the Rapa Nui people began a sustained process of cultural and political reclamation. Their language, their traditions, their extraordinary heritage of stone carving and navigation, all of it began to be recovered, documented, celebrated. The Moai themselves, some of the toppled figures carefully restored to their platforms by archaeological teams working in partnership with the Rapa Nui community, began to stand again. Today, Easter Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Reino Raraku quarry, where the Moai were carved, is protected. The restored Ahu platforms, with their standing figures silhouetted against the Pacific sky, draw visitors from every corner of the world. People who come, as Roggeveen's crew came, to stand before the stone giants and feel something that is very difficult to name. And what of Roggeveen's legacy? The quiet, careful Dutchman who started all of this. History has not always been generous to him. For a long time, he was remembered, if he was remembered at all, primarily as the man who had found Easter Island almost by accident, on his way to looking for something else. The great southern continent he had sought was never found on his voyage. The Society Islands and the Samoas slipped past without investigation. The African galley was lost. The ships were seized. The compensation, when it came, was partial. By the measures of commercial exploration, profit, territory, trade routes established, the voyage of Jacob Roggeveen was not a success. But history has other measures. He was the first European to cross the South Pacific on that particular route. He added more to the European understanding of the Pacific's true scale and character than almost any voyage before him. He gave Easter Island to the world's attention, and with it, one of the greatest mysteries and one of the greatest human stories that the ocean holds. And he did it at 62 years old, on his first command, carrying his father's dream across 2 oceans and around the most dangerous cape in the world. There is something in that which deserves more than a footnote. The Pacific tonight is as it has always been. Vast, dark, breathing slowly in the deep southern latitudes where Roggeveen's ships once pushed through swells that no Dutch keel had ever crossed. The Moais stand on their platforms above the water, the restored ones patient and still, their long stone faces turned toward the interior of the island as they have been turned for 500 years. The stars above them are the same stars that Roggeveen's navigators read from the swaying deck of the Eagle. The same stars that the Polynesian ancestors of the Rapa Nui people followed across 3,000 miles of open ocean to find this tiny, improbable, extraordinary place. The island does not need to be explained. It only needs to be felt. And you have felt it tonight. You have crossed the South Atlantic and rounded Cape Horn and stood on the black volcanic sand with a 62-year-old Dutch lawyer and looked up at the great stone faces against the Pacific sky. You have done all of that, and now it is time to rest. Let the images dissolve slowly, one by one, like stars fading at the end of a long night. The ships, the ocean, the stone faces, the quiet harbor at Batavia, the court in Amsterdam, the island, always the island, sitting alone at the edge of the world. Let it all go now. The voyage is complete. Sleep well.